Welcome to the Roberts Law Office Injury Podcast. Kentucky attorney Jeff Roberts has over 25 years of experience. He'll provide answers to your questions related to personal injury and automobile accidents, workers' compensation claims, and Social Security disability benefits. Let's join Jeff for this episode. And friends, welcome back. Once again, we're in Murray, Kentucky with workers' compensation attorney Jeff Roberts. Jeff, how are you, guy?
I'm doing good, Jim. How are you?
I'm doing well, buddy. So today we're going to talk about the nurse case manager. And this is someone that you may have run into in the past, but not really understood why they're there. So we're going to try to set that up, especially if you've been hurt in a workplace accident of some sort. So, Jeff, as we were prepping for this, you said the first time somebody's going to meet the nurse case manager is generally in the waiting room. And kind of walk us through what's going on.
Yeah, and usually about the only time you're going to ever deal with with a nurse case manager is in a workers' compensation claim. You don't see those in other types of litigation claims as a general rule. The nurse case manager is someone that is hired by the insurance company to frequently go to the doctor's appointments with the injured worker and kind of act as a go-between or a information conduit between the doctor and the insurance company.
So if I can, there are two major distinctions here. First of all, the doctor typically has nurses in the clinic or in the urgent care or the doctor's office, and those are normal nurses. The nurse case manager is a nurse, but that nurse case manager doesn't work for the doctor or that clinic. That nurse case manager is there because she works for the insurance company.
Correct. She is what I see in Kentucky, at least in Western Kentucky, as a general rule, is the insurance companies will typically contract with a company that provides nurse case managers, but there are a few insurance companies that have nurse case managers on staff. But either way, the nurse case manager is there because the insurance company is paying them to be there.
And again, unlike the nurses who work for the doctor or work in the doctor's clinic, she's not there to provide you with medical treatment or care. She is there with a different objective.
Correct.
Or he, I should say.
Yes. It could, there are male nurse case managers as well, and I've dealt with those. Yes, they are there, and they will tell you they're there to help facilitate your medical treatment, and to some extent they can do that and do that. But they also are reporting back pretty much everything you say to them. They're going to report back to the doctor. Depending on the stage of your case, how far long you've been off, they may be trying to get the doctor or talk the doctor into releasing you to return back to work, either light duty or full duty from that perspective. So they're not there providing any medical treatment for you at all. They don't provide medical treatment, but they are there to sometimes at least help get medical appointments approved, get diagnostic studies approved, and they can be beneficial in that regard. And I've had some nurse case managers over the years that I've worked for or worked with that I thought were fairly neutral. They were trying to get the medical treatment approved. They really weren't. They might ask a doctor about return to work, but they weren't real pushy about that. And I've had clients tell me, and frankly, some doctors that I've talked to tell me that some nurse case managers can be very, very pushy with them on getting them to try to release the injured worker to be able to go back to light duty or full duty so that the workers' comp insurance company no longer has to pay that workers' comp check.
Well, and that's the thing. At the end of the day, their role is to try to save money for the insurance company, which means it's not going to you in terms of benefits.
I think they would probably dispute that that's what the role is, but I think that's, in reality, I think that's what the role is, yes.
So when they talk to a doctor and they try to influence the types of treatment, how does that work? What are they, how would they do that, for instance?
Well, part of it is if you've got, they don't usually try to stop a doctor from doing certain diagnostic studies, but if the doctor is recommending 12 weeks of physical therapy, they may say, well, why don't you order 6 weeks? Let's see where he's at and see if he or she needs the other 6 weeks of therapy. Or they may, and I've had this occur where the client had COVID and missed a one therapy appointment. Therapy was delayed for 3 weeks because the insurance company didn't approve it. The client had some therapy, missed one therapy appointment before the follow-up visit, and then the nurse case manager said something to the doctor. Well, did his missing that therapy appointment delay his recovery from the injury? And the client was there at the time and basically said, I had COVID is the reason I missed that therapy appointment. And when doctor said, well, obviously he couldn't go then, and then he made the comment, and therapy got delayed for 3 weeks because y'all didn't approve it. It would have been completely done before I caught COVID if y'all had approved it in a timely fashion. So you've got to be careful at times with what the nurse case managers say to the doctors.
Well, and that's, there's always a question of, are they allowed to be in the examination room with you? I sometimes if I'm going to the doctor and I'm sitting there, I've probably got the hospital gown on or whatever, feeling a little exposed if you get my drift. And I may not want other people in the room.
That depends, frankly. Usually the nurse case managers are involved, or a lot of times they're involved before I ever get involved in the case myself. Once I get involved, if there is a nurse case manager, I put conditions on nurse case managers for them to be able to talk with my client. One of the conditions is that they not be present in the room when the client is being examined unless the client is comfortable with that. Some clients don't care if it's like a shoulder injury for a gentleman. They really don't care if somebody's in the room, and I don't care if they're in the room in that situation if the client's okay with it. But some aren't comfortable with that. So I let the client be the ultimate decision maker from that. But one of the conditions is if the client's not comfortable, you're not in there during the exam, you come in after the exam. Second condition I place on them is you don't have oral conversations with the doctor without the client being present. If they want to send something in writing, that's fine because I can document what they told the doctor, and if it's inaccurate, I can point that out to the doctor or to the judge later on. But if it's an oral communication, like on this one where they said the client missed the physical therapy appointment when the client had COVID, they didn't tell the doctor that the client had COVID. They just said he missed his last therapy appointment and asked if that delayed the treatment. Well, if the doctor had put in his office note, client missed therapy, delayed his treatment by not being non-compliant, the nurse case manager is never going to say, well, I told him he was non-compliant. I didn't tell the doctor that the worker had COVID, and trying to undo that in that situation is a lot more difficult. That's the reason I want my client present for any verbal communications that the nurse case manager has with the doctor. That
makes a lot of sense because, again, the way things are worded and a lot of these workers' compensation claims come down to what's in the doctor's notes, what is the record? Because a lot of times I would assume the doctor, if he gets called into a deposition later, isn't going to remember necessarily that examination. He's going to refer to his notes, or she's going to refer to her notes.
Absolutely, because they've seen, by the time the deposition's taken place, they've seen hundreds, if not thousands, of other patients since the last time they saw the injured worker. A lot of times, but over the course of time, they've seen a whole lot of other patients in that period of time, and trying to recall that one exam, they're not going to be able to do that.
Right. So again, if they can influence that doctor to write it a certain way, it kind of gets lost in the mix, and that becomes the record.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's the scary thing. What about medications? I mean, sometimes, not all medications are the same. I mean, the doctor sometimes could prescribe this one versus one that maybe is a little bit cheaper. And sometimes the cheaper version isn't always what the patient in this case, really should be having. Right?
And nurse case managers can try to influence that. In Kentucky, the workers' comp regs basically require that generics be used unless the doctor specifies otherwise, and very rarely does the doctor specify otherwise. If a generic's available, a generic is what the injured worker is going to be receiving from that standpoint. If it's a newer medication that does not have a generic available, those are usually much, much more expensive. And the nurse case manager can try to get the doctor to try to something that's been out a longer period of time that has a generic. So yes, you can certainly see them trying to influence it in that regard as well. But it's kind of up to, and I have these conversations with my clients, and to some extent, as far as influencing treatment, a big part of that is up to the doctor to basically say, look, I'm the doctor. I decide what treatment my client receives. And I understand the headache that doctors have in dealing with workers' comp insurance and regular health insurance, and having people who sometimes aren't doctors looking over their shoulder and saying, no, they don't need that, they need this, or why are you doing this? And it makes the practice of medicine much more stressful, because you're not able to do what you're wanting to do or hoping to do for your patient because of insurance affecting that. But as far as releasing them, return to work, standing pat on what medications they need, what diagnostic tests, that is to some extent depending on the doctor standing up for their patient there. And they're more, frankly, in my opinion, they're more likely to do that with the patient there too, which is another reason why I like the patient to be there when the nurse case manager is having any verbal communications with the doctor.
That makes a lot of sense. The the other issue is when a doctor is going to refer that patient out to a specialist. We've talked in previous episodes about the company doctors and how some doctors are more inclined to make certain decisions, because it may benefit the company. It's still okay for the client, but it's actually better, more cost effective for the company, so they may steer them certain directions. The nurse case manager can also try to influence which specialist that doctor refers the patient out to, and that could be a problem too, right?
Certainly, I see that frequently. If the doctor for instance, if you got a family doctor and they say, well, he needs to see an orthopedist and doesn't specify a specific orthopedist, then the nurse case manager will at times come in and say, well, what about Dr. So-and-so, and try to get them to refer to a specific doctor. If I'm involved, I can usually undo that if they're going to go to a company doctor before they get set up with that company doctor at that point. But you see that occur at times before I get involved. And I think we've talked in an episode previously about the designation of physician, the Form 113 form.
Yeah, that was episode 68.
Okay. And in regard to that, you frequently will see the nurse case manager, when they make that referral, try to get the injured worker to sign a new Form 113 designating this new company doctor as the new designated doctor. And then once you've made that change one time, as we talked about in that episode, you can't change your designated doctor again, the gatekeeper doctor, without approval from the insurance company. So it can make it more difficult.
Which they could also turn down, which means you're stuck.
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Friends, I'll put a link in the show notes to episode 68. You can also find it on Jeff's website. But if you go to episode 68, he'll talk about that designated physician's form and why that is so important, and some of the games that get played with that. No, by the way, there's also the back half of that episode is about getting certain expenses reimbursed. So you might want to take a listen.
Exactly.
So, we've talked about how the case manager may try to influence the doctor's decision on treatment. We've talked about medications. We've talked about referring out to different specialists. Let's jump into something called an impairment rating and how that can be influenced potentially by the nurse case manager.
Well, before we go there, I do want to cover one thing, because some people may be thinking, why do you let the nurse case manager be involved at all in these cases? And so I want to talk about that before we get to the impairment rating and the nurse case manager's involvement there. And the nurse case manager, while I've said a lot of things that they can do wrong, I put those conditions in place for a reason, and that's to limit any damage that they do from that perspective. And nurse case managers can actually do some good. When you have a nurse case manager involved, at least a good nurse case manager involved in a case, diagnostic testing seems to get approved much quicker. If the doctor needs an MRI and tells the nurse case manager there at that appointment, this patient needs an MRI of their shoulder, I'm going to order that. The nurse case manager frequently, and should always, but frequently will stay there, get that order right then, get it sent in to the insurance company, get that MRI approved much quicker than when it's just injured worker without a nurse case manager, because then the doctor's office gets it. They, however long it takes them to get it faxed up to the insurance company doesn't put a priority, and there was nobody following up on it. Have you approved this for this patient yet? So I frequently see with nurse case managers involved that they actually speed up some of the diagnostic testing that needs to be done so that my client can get the proper treatment that they need and get on the road to being fully recovered, which is where we want everybody, all of my clients, to get from that standpoint. That's the reason I do allow nurse case managers to be involved, but I do put those conditions on there. And if they don't agree with those conditions, they're told up front that if you don't agree with these conditions, you can't talk to the client, and I'll send a letter to the doctor. You can't have any more communications with the doctor. Usually most of the nurse case managers agree with the conditions, and that limits the negative impact they can have. I also have the conversation with the clients to make sure they are there and make sure they are making sure the nurse case manager is complying and letting me know if they don't comply.
Well, I've got to think it's such a shell game in the fact that if that person presents him or herself as a nurse, you start thinking, okay, she's here to help me, he's here to help me. But again, there's a game being played there if you're not real careful.
Correct.
And that's the one thing where I think a lot of people kind of get confused. If the doctor's office nurse shows up, yeah, that's fine. She's there to treat you or to help you. The nurse case manager, you just got to treat probably at arm's length and be a little bit better.
Correct. Yeah, and the of course the doctor's nurse is going to be asking you questions, taking vitals, etc. The nurse case manager shouldn't be doing any of that aspect from that standpoint.
But let me come back to the question I had a few minutes ago, though. It's the impairment rating, and again, that you want to. We've done it in a couple of episodes, but will you talk just briefly about what an impairment rating is, and then we'll come back to how the nurse case manager sometimes can improve which doctor is actually assigning that.
An impairment rating under Kentucky workers' compensation law, to get permanent disability benefits, whether it's permanent partial disability or permanent total disability, you have to have an impairment rating under the 5th edition of the AMA Guides to Impairment, which is a book that you've never heard of unless you've been involved in a workers' compensation claim, because that's about the only time that's ever used. In that book, when you look at it, it talks about how the body has been anatomically changed as a result of an injury or disease. And in the first or second chapter of the book, it says, this is talking about how the body's anatomically been changed. It is not occupational disability. The book should not be used for occupational disability. So the politicians in Kentucky and a lot of other states said, let's use this book for occupational disability. And so Kentucky and other states require an impairment rating under the AMA Guide. Kentucky uses the 5th edition. Some states use other editions from that. But the impairment rating should be the same per person for the same injury and the same complication, so to speak. If you've had a herniated disc and with surgery and you're completely pain-free, then everybody's impairment rating should be the same. But if you're if you do heavy construction work, your occupational disability, your restrictions are going to be much different and affect you much greater than if it's an attorney who has those set of restrictions. If you got a 50-pound lifting restriction, doesn't affect me practicing law. It affects someone who does heavy construction or carpentry work where you're packing sheets of plywood, 3/4-inch sheets of plywood, drywall, all of that, and you're no longer able to do that. That's the reason that's not supposed to be used for occupational disability. But in Kentucky, it's required. And even though the rating should be the same, frankly, the ratings vary by doctor to some extent.
Because it is subjective. At the end of the day, it's a subjective rating the doctor assigns.
It's a subjective rating. Some of the ratings are a range as well, and the doctor gets to pick within that range. So if you've had a fusion surgery, it can be 20 to 23%, or they can choose to rate it under a different section to either increase or lower the impairment rating depending on the doctor's mindset at that point. Some treating doctors do impairment ratings themselves, and I prefer treating doctors to do the impairment rating because I think you get a much more valid rating from the treating doctor, and it has more credibility with the judge as a general rule. But some doctors do not do an impairment rating, and so usually at one of the last visits, when the client reaches maximum medical improvement, and the doctor says you don't have to come back to see me anymore, just come back as needed if you need me. We're not scheduling a follow up, and then the impairment rating is done at that point. If it's a doctor who does not do their own impairment rating, then the nurse case manager certainly can have an influence on who that doctor sends the person to get an impairment rating done. And sometimes they will, and I've seen it where they've sent them to a physical therapist to do the impairment rating and then send it back for the doctor to sign off on the rating that the therapist gave. And frequently I've seen physical therapists whose impairment ratings are nowhere near what they should be because they don't apply all parts of the AMA guides when they do that, and I've got them corrected.
Well, they're not doctors.
They're not doctors, and some aren't trained as well, and they're looking at normally when I see a physical therapist do an impairment rating, they're just looking at range of motion, and they're not looking at other factors that come into play. And so, and I've got doctors correct the ratings in those situations, but if they can get the doctors to sign off, the treating doctor to sign off on a rating done by somebody else, then I've got to go back in and undo that rating and get the doctor hopefully to agree that wasn't correct. The rating should be this, and that affects the credibility of it. You got doctors saying, well, it's 10%, and then say, well, no, it's really 15% because the 10% didn't take into account this procedure that was done in this complication that the patient has. And so, it's if we get the treating doctor to refer to someone who is trained in doing impairment ratings and is, then you can get a much more accurate rating, and hopefully the treating doctor would agree at that point.
Well, I thought it was interesting. You mentioned previously a term called permanent partial disability. So, again, I'm not totally disabled. I am going to go back to work, but this impairment rating fills in the gap, right, from what I used to make to basically what I'm able to make now, because maybe I'm on light duty or maybe I'm on a different job because I do have some type of disability here. It's partial.
Correct.
But that rating is a key factor.
That's what the permanent partial disability is designed to do, and what you're entitled to will vary. I mean, the impairment rating is an important part. If you have a 0 rating, unfortunately, it doesn't matter. And it's very sad the way the law is written in this regard, but if you have a 0 impairment rating and you cannot go back to work, you're permanently totally disabled, and every doctor agrees. If you got a 0 rating, you don't get any benefits any permanent disability benefits under Kentucky law. But in determining what benefits you're entitled to, permanent partial, permanent total, your impairment rating, whether you're back at work, if you're back at work, are you earning the same or greater wage? What are the physical restrictions that are placed upon you? If you had a psychological injury as well, what psychological restrictions are placed upon you? And so, there's a variety of things that come into play in making the determination of what the permanent partial disability is or the permanent disability is. And that's where a lot of experts come into play that we've talked about before in other episodes, but that the impairment rating is one of the first numbers you have to have, and then all the others play into that.
That makes a little bit more sense as far as why you do not necessarily want that nurse case manager to have influence on who's actually doing that impairment rating, who's actually doing that examination.
Right.
And again, that circles all the way back to the fact that they work for the insurance company. They are ideally going to try to save money for the insurance company, not treat you better.
Correct. And and that's one of the reasons why you want to have an attorney on your side, because I've done this for 32 years now. I know which doctors the insurance companies use frequently, I know which doctors are fair in their evaluations of the injured worker. And even if the nurse case manager gets your doctor to send you to a doctor who is used regularly by insurance companies, an insurance company type doctor, to do the impairment rating, when you call me up and say, oh, they're scheduled me for this evaluation, and one of the things is my letter tells them they got to notify me of those appointments. But client calls me up and says they're going to send me to Dr. So-and-so to get an impairment rating. And my response is, well, we're going to somebody else to get the impairment rating. So, that's where having an attorney who is experienced in workers' compensation can be very valuable in making sure that you get what you're entitled to receive under Kentucky's workers' compensation law.
Well, what's interesting is you hit this point and you kind of brushed over it, but I always thought it was interesting. It's one of the most interesting episodes that we recorded, I think, and that has to do with the psychological aspect of some of these work injuries. And I know in a previous episode, in episode 51, we talked about PTSD, especially for first responders, and how there's a big gap there.
Correct.
And even if I've been involved in, maybe I've been hurt at work, I may be physically okay, but I may have PTSD really, to where I can't be around loud noises or I can't be around other triggering factors. And again, that all comes into these impairment ratings. So those are things that people are not really thinking about.
Correct. Yeah. I've represented several first responders throughout my career, and having PTSD is not an uncommon occurrence there. And even in work injuries in other settings, you can have can be PTSD depending on the type of injury that you experience. You see that a lot with car wrecks. Someone who's in a car wreck on the job, and they will have some PTSD as a result of that. But you also have other psychological injuries besides just PTSD. You can have depression, you can have anxiety that are associated with the work-related injury. As we talked about in that episode, one of the problems with Kentucky law, in my opinion, is that the psychological injury is only compensable if there's also a corresponding, at least physical component or physical contact. The physical part does not have to result in a permanent physical injury, but there has to be some sort of physical injury associated with that for the psychological injury to be compensable. So if you're if you're a first responder and respond to a bad car accident where young children died in that wreck, you're going to, frankly, most likely going to have psychological effects from that, and that's not going to be covered because there wasn't a physical trauma to you as a result of responding to that, and that's something that the legislature should have fixed a long time ago and needs to fix.
Well, and again, I'm going to loop this in because that wasn't just a rabbit hole we went down. When Jeff was talking about a physical therapist who may be trying to look at just range of motion, okay, John can lift his arm up this high, he can no longer get it straight up over his head, so that the impairment rating ought to be this. They're not thinking about the psychological factors that could come into play, whereas your treating doctor is probably looking at all of that more holistically, which means that impairment rating might be more in favor of that patient.
True. From that standpoint, a physical therapist would not be qualified to render a rating on a psychological condition anyway, so I would hope they would never try to do that. Normally you want to go to a psychologist or psychiatrist to get the psychological impairment rating from that, so that you can document that injury with a mental health professional. Licensed professional clinical counselor could do that rating as well, but you need a mental health professional to do the impairment rating, in my opinion, to do the impairment rating for a psychological injury.
Well, and I think, again, not having the nurse case manager steering that to the company person or somebody that's not really going to take in all these factors or overstep their area of knowledge.
Right.
Again, these are things you've got to be aware of. So when that person comes up and says, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm your nurse case manager," again, arm's length. As you said, there are some beneficial things they can do, but more often than not, they're there to save money for the insurance company.
Right.
That may not be to your best benefit.
Yeah.
Outstanding. Jeff, do me a favor. If somebody's listening to this episode and wants to ask you some questions about that or wants to talk to you about their workplace injury, what is actually the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Best way to get a hold of me is to call my office. I have offices in Murray and in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, but I have one number to use to call me. That way you can reach me regardless of which office I'm at. They're going to be able to track me down. The number is 270-753-0053. And there's also an 800 number, 1-800-844-5108. Either number rings to the exact same phone, so that's not going to be a problem. If you call in either number, you will reach my office in 95+% of the time, you're going to get a live person to answer that phone call if you call during business hours. You can also, if you're trying to reach out after business hours, you can email me at jeff@jeffrobertslaw.com as well.
And on the website, jeffrobertslaw.com, we've got a contact us, which generates an email, same kind of thing.
Yes.
And you've got a pretty interesting intake there. There's a little pop-up that shows up from time to time that says, hey, how can we help? And that can also take in some basic information.
That does take in some information, and that has, if you don't like to type a whole lot, that intake on there has like check boxes and all that will gather some information. You do have to input some stuff and type in your name and contact information, et cetera, from that standpoint. But it'll let you know, if it'll ask if you're workers' comp, car wreck, or whatever, and you just click the box, and then it takes you to more questions from that will give us more information. And when you go through that, I get an email. Shortly after that conversation, I will get an email, and then we will reach back out to you and talk with you further at that point.
Outstanding. Well, Jeff, it's always good to see you. Thanks for letting me come down and chat with you today, and we'll be back here in about 2 weeks.
Good seeing you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Roberts Law Office Injury Podcast. Jeff will return in 2 weeks. Until then, he invites you to visit jeffrobertslaw.com and follow his firm on Facebook. At the Roberts Law Office, you'll find a history of small town service and big city results.